The door to the private dining room didn't slam. That was the thing about men like Cassian Varro. They never needed to slam doors. The lock engaged with a single quiet click, and somehow that sound was worse than any raised voice Evelyn Marsh had ever heard in her life. She had been crying over the industrial sink in the kitchen of the Varro estate, convinced she was completely alone at 2:30 in the morning. The rest of the household staff had retired hours ago. The security rotation had just changed. She had calculated, with the precision of someone who had learned to survive inside a gilded cage, that she had exactly 20 minutes of privacy. She had miscalculated. Cassian Varro stood inside the kitchen doorway, still dressed from whatever late meeting had pulled him out of the city. His dark overcoat was folded over one arm. His tie was loosened by exactly 1 inch. He smelled of cold November air, black coffee, and something metallic she didn't want to think about too carefully. His eyes swept the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent 36 years reading rooms for threats. And then they stopped, with devastating precision, on the bruised arc of skin below her left eye. He didn't ask what she was doing awake. He didn't ask why she was crying. He just looked at her face and said, very quietly, "Who did that to you?" Evelyn Marsh was 28 years old, and she had not planned to spend her late 20s working as a private chef in a fortified compound outside Quebec City. 2 years ago, she had been finishing her culinary residency in Montreal, stage managing a kitchen at a Michelin-recognized restaurant in the Plateau, quietly building towards something she had been working at since she was 16 years old. She had a lease on a small apartment on Saint Denis Street. She had a 5-year plan. She had a life. Then her younger brother, Noah, had a debt. Noah was 23 and profoundly, catastrophically bad at understanding consequences. He had borrowed $42,000 from a crew connected to the Aldridge organization, a web of loan sharks, fencing operations and protection rackets that ran through Quebec's grey market construction sector. He had borrowed it to invest in a logistics startup that dissolved in 8 weeks. When the Aldridge crew came to collect, Noah didn't have the money. What he did have, without knowing it, was a sister willing to do anything to keep him breathing. The arrangement came through an employment agency that Evelyn would later understand operated as a placement service for people the underworld needed kept close. She dropped her residency. She packed a single bag. She accepted the position of private chef at the Varro estate, a sprawling stone compound set against the Laurentians, 2 hours north of the city, and began funneling 60% of her monthly salary back to the Aldridge crew every second Friday in cash, in a plain envelope left at a specific locker at the Gare du Palais. The Varro estate was not a home. It was a statement. 12,000 square feet of reconverted manor house, surrounded by a perimeter fence, she had been told. In her orientation, was monitored by passive deterrence. A phrase she eventually understood meant motion-triggered countermeasures she had no desire to test. The staff were efficient, minimal, and deeply committed to not asking questions. The head of household operations, a controlled, formal man named Mr. Oakes, had delivered her single standing instruction on her first morning: produce food of exceptional quality, do not engage the principal in personal matters, and be invisible everywhere except the kitchen. For nearly a year, Evelyn had been very good at being invisible. Cassian Varro was 41. He ran a privately held infrastructure holding company with stakes in construction, port logistics, and cold chain freight that moved through eastern Canada and into the northern United States. On paper, he was a legitimate businessman of considerable reputation. Off paper, he was the controlling force behind a network that shaped which contracts got awarded, which shipments moved uninspected, and which civic officials stayed comfortable in their positions. Evelyn had seen him in person perhaps a dozen times. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of angular face that looked like it had been drawn by someone who had run out of patience for softness. He moved through the estate with an absolute quietness that his men never quite managed to replicate. When he entered a room, the temperature seemed to recalibrate itself. The 3 times he had passed through the kitchen while she was working, he had not spoken to her. She was, as instructed, furniture, until a Friday in late November when Noah called her from a gas station payphone in Longueuil and told her that he was $2,000 short. The Aldridge crew had raised the weekly rate. They said they were adjusting for service fees. Evelyn knew this for what it was. They were tightening the rope. She had been 3 days away from her payment deadline and completely out of solutions. She hadn't slept properly in a week. She had been running mental calculations during every prep session, every plating, every quiet hour between service and morning setup, trying to find $2,000 she did not have. That Friday night, after the estate had gone dark and quiet, a man named Gary Purcell came to the kitchen door. Gary Purcell was a collector for the Aldridge organization. He was built like someone who had played defensive line in high school, and never stopped thinking of himself in those terms. He wore a parka with a logo from a roofing company that she was fairly certain did not exist. He smelled of cigarettes and vinyl car seats. He wasn't supposed to be there. The arrangement was always the Gare du Palais locker, always on a Friday, always anonymous. He had come to the estate. She had stepped outside the service entrance to receive a delivery, the only reason she was near the rear door at that hour, and he had materialized from the shadows of the property's service lane, where the camera coverage had a narrow dead zone beneath the old transformer box. He had grabbed her arm and told her, with a calm that was worse than shouting, that the Aldridge organization expected a full payment plus the $2,000 shortfall by Sunday. Or Noah would be taken somewhere that family members didn't visit. When she said she couldn't get it in 48 hours, he had looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that measured a person for what they were worth as a problem, rather than a human being, and hit her once, open-handed, across the face. "Think faster," he said, and walked back into the dark. Evelyn sat on the cold stone step for several minutes before she could stand. She pressed her forearm against her mouth and breathed until the nausea passed. Then she went inside, ran the coldest water she could stand from the kitchen tap over a cloth, pressed it to her cheek, and tried to construct a plan out of nothing. She had no plan. What she had was a kitchen at 2:30 in the morning, a bruised cheekbone, and the particular despair of a person who has run out of moves. She didn't hear him come in. "It was nothing," Evelyn said, and her voice cracked in the middle of the word. She gripped the edge of the sink. "I walked into the cold storage door frame in the dark. I'm sorry to be." "Stop." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the kind of voice that had spent decades not needing to raise itself to be obeyed. Cassian Varro set his coat on the back of a kitchen stool and walked toward her with the measured, unhurried pace of someone who was not asking permission to look at her. Evelyn pressed back against the sink, her heart striking the inside of her ribs in rapid, terrified beats. Every instinct she had developed in 11 months at the estate said, "Do not be a problem, do not be noticed, do not cost this man anything." He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she had to angle her face away to avoid looking directly at him. "Look at me," he said. She did, because refusing felt like falling. He examined the bruise with the same careful attention he presumably brought to contracts and maps and everything else in his life that required an accurate read. A muscle moved in his jaw. He didn't touch her. He just looked, and the quality of his stillness in that moment was the most frightening thing she had experienced in the entire year she'd spent inside his walls. "A door frame does that kind of damage across the zygomatic arch," he said quietly. "When someone has walked into it at speed, that bruise follows the contour of a flat hand. The impact was lateral." He paused. "I have been in this business for 20 years, Evelyn. I know the geometry of a strike." It was the first time he had said her name. She closed her eyes. The tears she'd been holding back since the service lane ran down her face before she could stop them. "Please," she said. "It's my problem. I'll handle it. I'm not going to cause any trouble for you or the estate. Please just let me. You are standing in my kitchen at 2:30 in the morning with a handprint on your face." His voice dropped to something that was almost gentle, which was somehow worse. "Whatever you believe this is, it stopped being only your problem the moment it happened on this property. Someone raised a hand inside my perimeter, Evelyn. That is not a thing I permit." She broke apart. Not dramatically. There was no room in her body left for drama. She simply ran out of the structural integrity to hold the story in. She told him about Noah, about the $42,000, the collapsed startup, the Aldridge crew, the Friday envelopes, the shortfall, Gary Purcell appearing at the service entrance where he was absolutely not supposed to be, and what happened after. Cassian did not interrupt. He listened with total stillness, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on her face with an attention that would have felt invasive if it hadn't also felt, paradoxically, like the first time in months that anyone had treated what she said as important. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He repeated. Not a question. More, like he was filing it somewhere. He came through the service lane. "There's a blind spot under the old transformer box." Cassian's eyes sharpened in a way that had nothing to do with her. A silence moved through the kitchen, cold and precise. "Who else knows about the lane coverage?" he asked quietly. She didn't understand the question immediately. Then she did. I don't know," she said. "I only knew because I noticed it by accident, the first week I was here. I never told anyone." Cassian looked at her for a moment longer, then straightened. He pulled out a phone she had never seen, matte black, no visible branding, and pressed a single contact. "Wake Hendricks," he said, and Sable. "Full perimeter review. Starting at the east service lane, nobody moves a vehicle in or out until I clear it, and bring me the coverage logs from the last 60 days. He ended the call and set the phone on the marble. Your brother's debt, Cassian said, his voice even and unhurried, is no longer something the Aldridge organization will be collecting on, and Gary Purcell made a mistake tonight that I intend to make very clear to him. Evelyn stared at him. Her hands were still shaking. You should understand something, he continued, and there was nothing warm in his voice, but there was a precision to it that felt, strangely, like steadiness. The employment arrangement you were placed into, I was aware it came through an intermediary. What I was not aware of was the nature of your obligation to the Aldridge crew. Someone in my organization knew. Someone cleared you for placement here without disclosing a critical detail about a competing organization's financial interest in you. He picked up his coat from the stool. That is not a leak I can leave open. He turned toward the hall. Don't go back to the staff quarters tonight. Mr. Oakes will show you to a room in the east wing. Don't open the exterior doors until I tell you it's clear. He paused at the kitchen doorway. And Evelyn. She looked up. No one touches what is under this roof. Not Gary Purcell, not the Aldridge organization, not anyone. His eyes held hers for a single weighted moment. Try to get some sleep. She did not sleep. She lay in a room that smelled of cedar and clean linen, staring at a ceiling she couldn't see in the dark, and thought about the sound of that phone call. The way he hadn't hesitated, the way 60 days of camera logs and a full perimeter sweep had been set in motion in the time it took her to wipe her face on the sleeve of her chef's coat. Somewhere in the estate, Cassian Varro was pulling on a thread, and she had no way to know what would unravel. At 5:30 in the morning, she heard the low pulse of vehicle engines moving on the gravel drive. At 6, a sharp knock came at the door. It was a man she knew only as Hendricks, head of the estate's security operations, broad-shouldered, perpetually expressionless, who told her that a room in the main wing had been designated for her use until further notice, that Mr. Oakes had already moved her belongings, and that she was not to report to the kitchen until Mr. Varro had spoken with her. Also, Hendricks added, as if reporting a minor logistical update. Her brother Noah had been picked up from his apartment in Longueuil at 4:15 a.m. and was currently being transported to a private residence in the eastern townships. He would have a secure phone by noon. Evelyn sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands over her mouth. Noah, who had dragged them both into this by accident and impulse, and a 23-year-old's catastrophic optimism. Noah, who was safe. She didn't cry this time. She didn't have anything left. By 9 o'clock, the estate had become something else entirely. The quiet efficiency of a private household had been replaced by a precise, controlled tension, the kind that didn't announce itself in noise or visible panic, but in the way men moved through corridors with increased purposefulness, and the way certain doors that had previously been open were now closed. Cassian found her in the solarium off the main hall, a long glass-enclosed room overlooking the November landscape, the Laurentian hills pale gray and stripped of leaves. He was dressed for the day now, and looked, to the casual observer, like a man who had slept 8 hours. She had been awake all night and could read the lines around his eyes clearly enough to know he hadn't. A man she recognized as Sable, one of the senior security coordinators, mid-40s, always wore the same dark fleece regardless of the weather, was at the glass table with a laptop. He nodded at Evelyn without surprise, which told her Cassian had already briefed him on her presence. Sit, please, Cassian said, gesturing to a chair beside him. She sat, feeling entirely out of scale with the room and everything in it. The coverage gap in the service lane, Cassian said, without preamble, was not accidental. Someone requested the maintenance rerouting on that transformer box 11 weeks ago. The work order was filed by a staff member in our technical operations team, a man named Brian Kowalski, who has been with this household for 4 years. His voice carried no particular emotion. Brian Kowalski has been on the Aldridge payroll for approximately 9 months. He created the blind spot so that their collectors could access the property without detection. And he knew you would be at the service entrance last night because he monitored your kitchen schedule and relayed it. Sable turned the laptop to show a column of timestamps and transfer records. Gary Purcell didn't find the lane by accident, Evelyn said, understanding moving through her like cold water. No, he was placed there deliberately. Your shortfall was a pretext. Cassian leaned forward slightly. The Aldridge organization has been trying to establish leverage over this property for 2 years. You were their best attempt yet. A person with a financial obligation to them, placed inside my staff, who they could pressure into extracting information or access. They weren't interested in $42,000. They were interested in what you might eventually give them. Evelyn felt sick. I wouldn't have. I know. He said it without emphasis as fact, which is why this conversation is happening at this table and not differently. Sable closed the laptop. Brian Kowalski is currently in the security suite, Cassian said. He's been cooperative. Gary Purcell is being located. He said the word located with the specific flatness of someone who did not mean found gently. And the Aldridge organization is going to receive a communication this morning that renegotiates the terms of our coexistence in this region. He stood, moving to the window. The pale winter light made him look carved, static, like something out of old stone. You were placed here without full disclosure, he said with his back to her. That failure belongs to my placement process, not to you. Your brother's debt is resolved. The Aldridge organization's claim on you, your salary, and your family is terminated effective this morning. He paused. Whether you choose to stay in this position after today is your decision to make freely. She looked at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, at the way he stood with the landscape behind him like he had always been part of it. Why? The question came out small and direct. He turned. Because you spent nearly a year in my household, doing your work without complaint, carrying an obligation you shouldn't have been carrying alone, and you didn't compromise this house once. He crossed back to the table. And because Gary Purcell put his hands on you on my property, and I don't make exceptions for that. He looked at her face. The bruise had deepened overnight to a dark purple bloom across her cheekbone. There's a medical kit in the East Wing bathroom, he said quietly. Arnica will help with the swelling. Then Sable's radio crackled. She heard it later, not the specifics but the shape of it, the sound of a decision being carried out. She was back in the East Wing when a door somewhere in the main corridor opened and closed with a deliberate finality, and she understood, without needing to be told, that Brian Kowalski would not be returning to the technical operations office. She pressed her back against the wall of the guest room and breathed through it. This was the world she had stepped into, not through ambition or excitement or any romantic misunderstanding about what men like Cassian Varro actually were, but through a younger brother's bad luck and her own refusal to let him face the consequences alone. She was not naive about what lived on the other side of that closed door, but she was also, for the first time in 11 months, genuinely structurally safe. And that distinction mattered in a way she hadn't expected it to. 3 days passed. The estate recalibrated around a new reality. 2 additional security staff joined the perimeter rotation. A new technical systems manager arrived from Montreal on the 2nd day. Mr. Oakes moved Evelyn's kitchen schedule to a later morning start and, for reasons he did not explain, assigned her 2 additional prep hours and significantly expanded her access to the estate's ingredient ordering account. On the evening of the 3rd day, Cassian appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7 o'clock, an hour before dinner service, and stood there with the particular stillness of someone who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "You're still here," he said. "I'm still here," she confirmed, not looking up from the leek and potato soup she was finishing. "Most people in your position would have left." She considered that. "Most people in my position don't have a 23-year-old brother who's safe in the eastern townships for the first time in 2 years." She set down her ladle. "Besides, the kitchen's exceptional." Something shifted at the edge of his expression. Not quite a smile. More like the thing that happens to a face when it remembers that smiling is possible. He came into the kitchen and sat without being invited. On the same stool he'd rested his coat on 3 nights before. Watched her work. She let him. "Your brother," he said, after a while. "Noah. He's 23. He's an idiot," she said, and then immediately, "He's a good idiot. He just doesn't think about consequences. Most 23-year-olds don't. You did." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't have the option not to." She understood what that meant well enough not to press it. She plated 2 bowls of soup from force of habit, set one on the pass, and pushed it toward him without comment. He looked at it, then at her, with an expression no one had handed him a bowl of soup casually in quite some time. He ate it. He didn't compliment it, which somehow meant more than if he had. The situation with the Aldridge organization resolved with a speed that Evelyn found instructive. She later pieced together the sequence from fragments overheard and things Hendricks mentioned in passing. Cassian had communicated directly with the organization's senior principal, a man named Devereux, who ran operations out of a commercial property in Laval. The communication, whatever form it took, had been sufficiently persuasive that by the following Wednesday, the Aldridge organization had withdrawn their collectors from 2 of the 4 districts where they overlapped with Varro interests, had returned the physical contents of the locker at the Gare du Palais, including 3 months of Evelyn's prior payments, and had sent, through an intermediary, a written acknowledgement that no outstanding financial obligation existed for any member of the Marsh family. Gary Purcell was not mentioned anywhere in this sequence of events. Evelyn decided not to ask about Gary Purcell. Noah called her from the eastern townships on a Thursday afternoon, sounding, for the first time in 2 years, like himself, uncertain, and chastened and deeply relieved. He asked her 4 times if she was okay. She told him she was. She didn't tell him much else, because there wasn't a version of the story she could tell him that he would be able to hold safely. "You can come home eventually," she said. "Just not yet." "Is it dangerous where you are?" She looked out the kitchen window at the frost-covered grounds, at the pale line of the Laurentians in the distance, at the 2 figures in dark jackets moving along the perimeter fence with the easy competence of people who knew exactly what they were protecting. "No," she said, and meant it. It was 2 weeks after the night of the locked door that Evelyn made a mistake. She had been in the walk-in cooler at the back of the kitchen, reorganizing the cold storage from a delivery that had been packed incorrectly, and she had not heard him come in. When she pushed back through the heavy insulated door, Cassian was standing at the central island reviewing something on a tablet, and she startled badly enough to knock a tray of mise en place onto the floor. He looked up. She crouched to pick up the scattered items, furious at herself for the gracelessness of it, and he crouched at the same time. On the other side of the tray, and for a moment they were both on the same level, which almost never happened in this house, in this world, and his hand closed over hers on a small container of sea salt. Neither of them moved. "I'm sorry," she said, "for no particular reason." "Don't apologize for being startled," he said. His voice was different at this distance, quieter and less constructed. "You've spent a year being told to be invisible. It's reasonable to be thrown when someone appears." She looked up at him. He was watching her with an attention she hadn't been the recipient of before, not the assessing attention of the employer, or the sharp attention of the strategist, but something slower and more uncertain, which on Cassian Varro looked like a rare form of vulnerability. He set the salt container carefully on the tray. He did not move his hand from where it was. "You told me you'd stay because the kitchen was exceptional," he said. "I did. Was that the whole reason?" She looked at him for a moment that stretched slightly past comfortable. "No," she said. "It wasn't the whole reason. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply looked at her with those grey eyes that had spent 20 years seeing through everything, and apparently had not been prepared, at 41, for a woman, kneeling on a kitchen floor, answering his questions with the particular directness of someone who had already survived the worst thing that could happen and found that honesty was less expensive than its alternative. He stood. He helped her up. He took the tray from her and set it on the counter with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who was buying himself time to think. "I'm going to Montreal on Thursday," he said. "There's a meeting I can't avoid and one I can. I intend to avoid the second one and be back before dinner service." She looked at him, slightly baffled by the information. "I'm telling you this," he said, "because I want you to know when I'll be home." Something rearranged itself in her chest, quietly and without fanfare. "I'll have something ready at 7, she said. He nodded. He picked up his tablet. He walked out of the kitchen with the same self-possessed quietness he brought to every room he entered, and she turned back to her counter and pressed her palms flat against the cool marble and breathed until her heartbeat steadied. Thursday came. He was back by 6:40. She didn't comment on the fact that he'd come back early. She put dinner on the pass at 7, and he sat at the kitchen island instead of the dining room, which she understood was a preference he'd been performing for weeks now without either of them naming it. He ate. She cleaned the station. They talked about the soup, a bisque she'd made from a heritage squash variety she'd sourced from a farm outside Freleidsburg, and then about the farm, and then, somehow, about the particular quality of late autumn light in the eastern townships, which they had both, for different reasons, been spending time with recently. "Noah calls it the tired light," she said, "the way it goes golden thin before it gives up for the winter." Cassian was quiet for a moment. "That's accurate. He has his moments. You've protected him his entire life." She considered denying it and didn't bother. "He needed it." "So did you," he said. "You just didn't have anyone doing it." She looked at him across the clean marble island in the kitchen that had become, without either of them planning it, the one room in the estate where the rules that governed everything else seemed to temporarily not apply. "I do now," she said. He looked at her steadily. He reached across the island and, with the same deliberate care he had brought to every gesture since that first night, covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said. "You do." Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on the Laurentians, soft and indifferent and clean, covering everything that needed covering, making the world manageable again. Inside the Varro estate, in a kitchen that smelled of brown butter and Wittenter squash, and the faint cedar smoke of a fire lit somewhere deep in the east wing, the woman who had arrived as invisible, and the man who had spent his entire life keeping everyone at distance, sat in the quiet and did not move apart. The girl who had come north to disappear had become, without quite deciding to, the one person in this fortified and complicated house that its owner could not look away from. And for the first time since the night on St. Denis Street when she'd packed a single bag and told herself this was temporary, Evelyn Marsh did not want to be anywhere else.